fine friends and Trinket fans. I'm Jess, and this is Trinket Picnic, a podcast where we talk all things small, whimsical, impractical, collectible, lovable, and obsessable, and we take the deepest dives possible, with, of course, plenty of side quests, as we wander through the history and lore of life's little things. What's a trinket? Well, that's for you to decide, but today we are going where I haven't yet gone on my own shelves. Sylvanian Families.
Sylvanian Families. They come from far and near, a brand new...
And for today's picnic, I'm drinking, this is called Famous House Taiwanese Mango Milk. And I'm drinking this purely because when I saw this can on the store shelf, the sort of soft yellow and tan colors along with little bits of green and brown reminded me of the most common Sylvanian Families packaging. And I just thought it would keep me in the, Sylvanian mood. So let's give it a try. Okay. All right. Actually, much more subtle than I was expecting, which actually is kind of nice. It's a little bit more refreshing. Okay, let's get cracking. So I'm going to be honest and make plain what I quickly glossed over a minute ago. So as of me writing this episode outline, I don't actually own a single Sylvanian Families figure or accessory, and I never have. And I think that maybe this episode is actually all about me deciding whether or not I'm going to finally step over that line and buy one. Take the Sylvanian plunge, so to speak. Honestly, as a lifelong trinket collector and a miniatures lover, I'm surprised I have yet to collect these figures. Now, I'm saying figures as if they are like collectible designer toys made for adults, but this is not the case. So for those who don't know what these things are, let me give you a sort of quick starter guide to this toy line before we dive deep and get nitty-gritty on all the history. So Sylvanian Families, which are known as Calico Critters in North America, and I'll talk more about that later. These are, in fact, a children's toy from Japan that consist of plastic anthropomorphized animal figurines that have then been flocked with tiny nylon and polyester fibers to make them firm and sturdy and yet soft. It's kind of like a dog or a cat's head, like that part right above their eyes. I guess you might call it their forehead. Yeah, it kind of feels like that. So anyway, Epic, which is the Japanese company who created Sylvanian Families, was, before making this toy, primarily known as a video game console company. And in the 80s and 90s, they became fairly well known for producing a bunch of Doraemon games. And according to them, they had made this type of stuff targeted at boys. And just like practically every other toy company around the world, they were looking to expand into the girls' market. This was just kind of the trend that was happening at the time. And Sylvanian Families is what Epic came up with. The Sylvanian Families toy line includes not just these flocked figurines. This is very important. Now, the figurines themselves are commonly released in these like heteronuclear family sets, and they all come with names and backstories and careers and prescribed personalities. But there are also lots of accessories and play sets So you can find clothes and furniture and miniature food and vehicles and houses and, I don't know, town buildings. You get the idea. There are lots and lots of little details on all of these figures and sets. For instance, you often see like painted piping underneath the sinks, or you can find drawers that open, clothes with buttons and collars. There's pots with removable lids and tiny cutlery and, I don't know, like toast that comes out of the toaster. And so to kind of sum it up, like really simplify it on an object level, we are basically talking about a highly themed, highly detailed dollhouse toy. And of course, there is also plenty of media to go along with this toy, both sanctioned and unsanctioned. And in fact, it was one particular piece of unsanctioned media that spurred me onto finally making this podcast. And not only that, to start with an episode featuring an object that I don't actually own. But we'll get into all of that much later. For now, let's ease into our deep dive and talk about the design and style of this toy. So, while the figures, and I mean the little animal characters, have largely stayed nearly identical to the ones made in the 1980s, which, by the way, is pretty incredible in and of itself. I mean, let's just stop and think about all of the many iterations of, I don't know, My Little Pony or Ninja Turtles, right? It's pretty incredible that the little animal dolls have, with very few exceptions, haven't changed much. I mean, the furniture and other accessories, however, have largely gone through many, many transformations. Originally, the furniture and accessories were mostly made of wood and also ceramic. Now, this change to plastic within a couple of years, some people claim that this change happened due to just it being cheaper to produce plastic accessories, but according to the Japanese Wikipedia page, the actual driving force seems to be that the toy gained the ST mark, which is a Japanese toy safety standards mark that involves basically like looking at the toy's mechanical and I think physical properties, as well as chemical properties, especially with things like flammability. And for some reason, I guess plastic was a better fit for all of that. And I'm telling you this mostly because I really want to begin to paint a picture of the original aims of this toy. The company designing and making Sylvanian Families did not have to make these things out of wood and ceramic. I mean, yes, 40 years ago might seem like ancient history, but there were plenty of toys being made fully of plastic, even in the 80s. So there had to be sort of a specific goal that the company had in mind in designing the toy and also its accessories in this way. I'm assuming that most of you listening know what these figures actually look like because you've probably seen them in real life or maybe online or at the very least on the cover art for this episode. And given their sort of Western, I don't know, like mid-century appearance, you might be surprised to find that Sylvanian Families is, as I mentioned a minute ago, in fact, a Japanese toy. They were created in the 1980s, and the whole Sylvanian world is centered upon this sort of, I don't know, romantic, rural, and by romantic, I mean like romanticized, rural, maybe kind of British universe. So you've got your, I don't know, your country homes and your cottages and your manor houses, and there are also tree houses and backyard playhouses and lodges, and even like a red roofed tower. And I think also they've come out with a couple of windmills. Inside, you can find things like claw-footed tubs and faux upholstered dining chairs, and in the yard you can put out your white picket fence. So on first glance, nothing like screams Japanese in the aesthetic, like in particular. But though, now that I'm thinking about it, this is exactly what the Japanese love and are good at. So I think, now we need to go on a little side quest. I think it's important to remember that Epic, the company ultimately responsible for Sylvanian Families up until this very day, is a Japanese company with Japanese ideals and Japanese culture. And more specifically, I guess, Japanese way of thinking. This will be important to remember, I think, in our podcast when we talk about some of the more like weird stuff that's happened over the years with this toy. But for now, let's talk about Japan's love of the European aesthetic. Think about some of the Japanese animation movies from, say, Studio Ghibli. Hayao Miyazaki and some of the other directors and producers at Ghibli have openly spoke of their love for European architecture and also European stories, and they have used these things in their animations. Or, I don't know, what about Japan's obsession, like with non-Japanese characters, like the Moomins? Or Miffy. Yeah, Miffy, the rabbit, is actually Dutch. And in the Netherlands, she is called Nijntje. And while there is a Miffy museum in the Netherlands, the world's first Miffy theme park will be opening very soon in Nagasaki, Japan, or it possibly might have already opened up. It's opening sometime during summer of 2025. And in fact, this Miffy park will be housed inside Japan's largest theme park, Haus ten Bosch, which is essentially a theme park all about Dutch culture with sort of general European vibes. There was already a Miffy parade at this park. Okay, and a Miffy menu, like with character cafe type themed food. And of course, yes, plenty of Japanese exclusive Miffy merchandise for you to buy. I'm pretty sure, I'm not going to take the time to look it up right now, but I'm pretty sure that this theme park was actually dreamt up during the 80s, just like Sylvanian Families. And I believe the founder visited the Netherlands and then just loved it so much that he decided to build a replica in Japan. So, yeah, maybe it's not so surprising that Sylvanian Families came from Japan. By the way, super side note, Miffy turns 70 this year, and Hello Kitty turned 50. And let's see, as well as My Melody, her BFF. Not really. But for the past year, Sanrio has been celebrating Hello Kitty's 50-year birthday. So, this is definitely an awesome year for birthdays and anniversaries. And honestly, it has been further motivation and inspiration for me to really get started on this podcast. Okay, so as you can now probably know or guess, Sylvanian Families is not some obscure or niche toy. Okay, their destiny is not one of only being popular in Japan and, perhaps championed by the occasional crazed foreigner. Okay, these are not Kibito Zukan figures. After their official launch in Japan in 1985, Sylvanian Families were then distributed in North America and the UK and other areas of Western Europe in 1987. and are now sold in more than 70 countries. That's 40 years of history and distribution. Something like more than 200 million of these things have been sold. So why have I yet to own any? I mean, this actually makes no sense to me. Beyond me being an absolute trinket lover and collector, I'm also a fan of Japanese media and merchandise and goods, and pretty much anything tiny and cute. I was also born in the 80s, so I was in the perfect age group, basically, for these toys when they first came out. And I loved Barbies and Polly Pocket and also Mighty Max and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and all of their play sets that went along with those, and of course like Legos and things like that. So I want to take some time and talk about this because from the beginning, Epic knew that they wanted to export this toy. It was part of the plan. And there I was, alive and well in the 80s, living as a little kid, a girl in the USA, the largest consumer market. So how did I not have these? Well, first, one of my suspicions is simply just the flocked nature of the toy. I'm pretty sure it kind of freaked my parents out. They had already been scarred by a flocked toy horse that I had decided needed a makeover with markers. And it was not a pretty sight. And no, my mom was not able to wash out the marker stains. I assume because of the flocking. So maybe it just came down to that. But I think it also could have been their comparably high price point. These toys, frankly, were and kind of still are quite expensive compared to a lot of the other plastic toys. Like, you will easily pay 20 or 30 euros on a small contemporary set of maybe like 4 small figures. And, oh yeah, by the way, I might be referencing sometimes euros when talking about prices, and that's because I live in Europe, but many times I will try to switch back over into the American dollar, which might be a little bit more helpful for some listeners. So anyway, let's also remember in regards to this expensive price that these were not your run-of-the-mill doll, with ugly clothes and made of itchy crap fabric with a non-existent hem, right? The accessories are not cheaply made. You don't get some garish, solid pink, barely sculpted disc of plastic that is supposed to resemble a miniature cake. The Sylvanian miniature cakes, yes, while still plastic, are made from separately molded and individually painted parts. You get cakes with bright red berries sitting on pillowy whipped cream, or painted key lime topping with golden crusts on the pies. There is a reason for the high price point. And yes, I spent too much time looking at pictures and videos of the Sylvanian Families village cake shop, ditto the supermarket and bakery sets. By the way, none of this was by accident. I'll talk a bit more about this later, but even the CEO of Epic has plainly stated that with Sylvanian Families, they are targeting not only kids and girls specifically, but adults. And because of this, the quality has to be higher. The quote-unquote level of beauty is an extremely important criteria. And when you see these things in person, like when you hold one of these toys in your hand, that beauty and attention to detail is impossible to miss. Now, would 5, 6, 7-year-old me have appreciated the difference between my Barbie pizza accessory, which, let's get real, was essentially just a flat plastic coin with a sticker on it? How does that compare to the Sylvanian pizza with the molded and individually painted toppings? Would I have noticed the difference? Perhaps. To an extent, I probably would have. But would my super young and busy and full-time working parents have cared about the quality difference, especially when there was such a large price difference? To be honest, I'm not sure that they would have. But who knows? Maybe it wasn't any of these things. Perhaps back then, Sylvanian families were just still too obscure in North America for my parents or grandparents to have known about them, especially when living under the shadow of huge Titan franchises that I was already collecting. Barbie, Ninja Turtles, My Little Pony, right? So, I don't know. Now I'm kind of beginning to wonder, did Sylvanian families actually have a decent presence in America in those early years? Like, say, the late 80s and into the early 90s? Maybe I had already started aging out of the category at that point. And also, as a person who grew up in America, it's just hard not to wonder about the other big mystery. How and when did they actually become Calico Critters? Like, what was actually happening with this toy during those years of the late 80s and into the early 90s? Well, let's dive a bit deeper now into Sylvanian history with another tidbit from my memories. Because really, do I even have any memories of this toy from when I was a kid? Well, no, actually. The only thing I can remember in connection to it was a cartoon produced in the late 80s and then broadcast in America during the 90s. Now, I want to take some time and talk about this cartoon because cartoons and toys have such an interconnected history. And to use a toy to market a show, or the other way, use a show to market a toy, well, pretty much every company was doing this. But the funny thing about the Sylvanian toys is I think that this was the only cartoon, or like one of the few, where as a kid, I didn't realize that there was actually a toy behind the cartoon. Like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, My Little Pony, Mighty Max, Ghostbusters, G.I. Joe. Like, even as a kid, I knew that there was some toy in connection to the show. So even though the cartoon was literally called Sylvanian Families, I had no idea. Maybe this was because the style of the show and the character's design just does not track much with the toy line. One of the biggest examples of this is the eyes. The toys have a very distinctive black beaded eye. It's the one thing that some people say creeps them out about the toy. In the cartoon, though, their eyes look similar to Care Bear eyes, which isn't surprising given that the two cartoons were produced by the same company, Deke Animation City, which was originally an American outpost of a French media company. Now, I loved the Care Bears, okay? I watched it pretty religiously as a kid and was always like very hyped to see the cloud cars and all their tummy tattoos, which is what I called them. And I basically held my breath every episode waiting for the Care Bear stare. So I definitely have early childhood memories of media. And yet, the only thing I can remember of the Sylvanian Families cartoon is the beginning of each episode, which I remember featured a kid with some kind of problem. And then this guy called like the Woodkeeper or something like that. I have no idea who that guy was, but In the show, the woodkeeper guy, he shrinks the kids down so that they can then magically enter a mouse-sized door to Sylvania. I'm pretty sure my brain only held on to this memory because as a child, my number one goal in life was to shrink down and live in my dollhouse or Polly Pockets. Like from ages, I don't know, from about 4 to probably like 7 or 8, if you asked me what I wanted to be when I grow up, I would have said miniature. So the beginning portion of this show, which literally like lasts like only like 20 seconds, that's the only thing I remember. The rest is totally forgettable for me.
Huh? You'll see what I mean. Getting small, smaller, smallest.
Until I became an adult and then a parent, I had no further connection with this toy at all. That's probably like 30 years of me not thinking about this toy that apparently existed in all the places that I had lived during those 30 years. For me, it's just like, I don't know, the Sylvanian Families just blew away in the wind. But, what about Calico Critters? As I've said, I grew up in America, lived a lot of my adult life there, so do I have any memories of those? Any childhood memories of Calico Critters? And no, no memory of those either. For those of you new to Sylvanian Families, you might be wondering, what is the actual link between Sylvanians and Calico Critters? Are they really the exact same thing? Are they owned by the same company? Like, what is the actual connection between these two names, between the toys? The short answer is that Calico Critters is what Sylvanian Families is called in North America. They are both, to this day, owned and controlled by Epic. How and why this came to be, though, is a little more confusing. I was going to say murky, which is also true. But let's just say that the early history of the Sylvanian Families brand in America, as far as the toy releases go, yes, is a bit murky, foggy, to say the least. But we're here to settle in. That's right. We're going to get cozy now, get in deep with the nitty-gritty details. So let's get cracking on some of this early history. The one thing that is clear from the history is that when the toy first arrived in the USA, they were marketed and sold as Sylvanian Families. The name change to Calico Critters happened years later. Now, a lot of this confusion just stems from the nature of the toy industry, in which you often have more than one company involved. You've got the toy creator, and then the manufacturer, and then you frequently have like a toy distributor and even a toy marketer. All of these can be separate companies. Things can also get more complicated when there are characters or brands that are licensed or merchandise that is a product of some kind of collaboration deal. For Sylvanians in North America, there is further confusion about when the toys actually arrived, like being debuted on store shelves. There are some sources, like Wikipedia, that claim they arrived in 1985. But honestly, I was suspicious of this date right from the beginning of my research because, yes, I am definitely one of those nerds who clicks on all of the sources. And there was no citation on the Sylvanian Families Wikipedia article for the 1985 date. So, of course, I went hunting, and I found some posts on Reddit from seemingly knowledgeable and respected collectors who also claimed that the 1985 date was incorrect. And that, in fact, they had arrived in 1987, which was a date that they also arrived in the UK. And yet, no one was even able to pinpoint to specific evidence of the 1987 date in the USA. So I won't lie, I became a little obsessed with figuring out the truth. I just couldn't believe that there wasn't some kind of publicly accessible information. Maybe it was the fact that I was born in the 80s in America, and I just felt this sort of unexplainable and probably slightly irrational connection to these toys, and I just needed to know when I would have come across them as a child. So after extensive research, please, you have no idea how many old toy catalogs I looked through on Pinterest and sites like issue.com. Well, after all that, I was finally able to find satisfying evidence of an actual debut year. Before I get into the specific history of Sylvanians arriving in America, it's important to emphasize that this was an absolutely wild time in toy history. You have giants like Hasbro and Mattel, they are really they're fighting it out to outsell each other. This is the time of rapidly growing franchises, both old and new. We're talking, like I've mentioned many times, My Little Pony, also Transformers, and of course Barbie and Hot Wheels. And at this point now, everyone is always looking at Japan and also other overseas toys and markets. Toys are beginning to go back and forth across the ocean, and sort of all in the name of trying to find the next big thing. Even if you just look at the sets that Epic was producing for its domestic Japanese market in those early years, and let me tell you, there were tons, it is nearly impossible to catalog and categorize everything. Because there weren't just the regular pieces like the original animal figure sets, which I believe there were nearly 20 different animal family sets released in just the first couple of years in Japan. Okay, that's not 20 figures. That's 20 animal families. You got the gray rabbit family, the brown bear family, gray mouse family, fox family, beaver family. It goes on and on. Each of these would have some kind of dad character, a mom character, and 2 or 3 kids. And also many of the families also had grandparents released as well. And of course, you have all of the original play sets released next to all of these figures, all of the houses and furniture. And to top it off, in Japan, there were also many special releases, like anniversary figurines and sets only acquired by lottery or at a specific location, or just unusual pieces that were just ended up being quickly discontinued or only originally made in extremely low numbers, as a part of the plan. And yes, I'm definitely going to talk about some of these unusual and rare sets later in the episode. But you can now see why it's really hard to know what came out when and even where in a definitive or comprehensive way. And it only became more complicated when Epic started distributing overseas. And they originally did through a company called Tomy. Now, Tomy is another Japanese company, and they had a lot of experience bringing Japanese toys to international markets. Tomy and Epic would partner for many years in many countries, and this is when you start to get more regional exclusives of Sylvanian Families. You get special figures released in limited ways, and then sometimes, often then re-released later on in other countries. There were even small like mold changes when the new distributor got involved. And apparently this was just during a time, this was all back before like toy companies and distributors had to keep like meticulous records, meticulous like catalog of all their releases. So honestly, all of this information is probably, or at least a portion of it, is kind of lost to the mists of the past. And but you know, I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. Let's talk about Tomy and the few, we'll call them breadcrumbs, that they did leave behind in America. One of those breadcrumbs for me was a YouTube video. The video is essentially like a slideshow of images from a Sylvanian Families booklet with story stickers. The last page of the booklet says, quote, Tomy Corp., a subsidiary of Calico Industries, Inc., end quote. And then it gives an American P.O. box. Now, most casual collectors know that Tomy were distributing the Sylvanian Families toys for Epic worldwide at that point. However, this was the first time I had heard of a company called Calico being involved. There is no mention of them whatsoever on the Wikipedia page, at least as of, summer of 2025, or on the fandom wiki. And honestly, almost on all of the other various fan sites, there was no mention of their name. By the way, Calico is not to be confused with Calico. These are two separate things. The name Calico, Coleco, that's the name that comes from the company's original name, Connecticut Leather Company. They basically grab the first two letters of each of those words. Very creative. Anyway, that's how Calico, that name, came to be. Anyway, for those who don't know, Calico was well known for early video game consoles. Anyone slightly older than me remember ColecoVision? And they also made some arcades and a few popular toys, probably the most popular, which I had known them for, were Cabbage Patch. Yes, they were the original sort of company that had produced the Cabbage Patch doll. They also are pretty well known for making the talking Alf doll. So I don't know if you remember either of those, but that came from Calico. They also made like a ton of action figures that were from pretty well-known franchises like Rambo and Pac-Man and Donkey Kong. So although they started as the leather and footwear company in the 1930s, over the following 50 years, they basically morphed into an electronics games manufacturer and then a toy company. And that's how they ended up being connected to Tomy. By the way, another little side note here. Of course, now that I know of Calico and I understand their relationship with Sylvanian Families a bit more, I, of course, now notice their name here and there on some of the old American packaging. For instance, like the original Sylvanian Families schoolhouse. But as far as I can tell, with sort of just general historical browsing, you rarely come across their name specifically, like in conjunction with the toy's American debut. It's just always Tomy is who you hear about as far as distribution. So I went digging for info about the relationship between Tomy and Calico, and I found an LA Times article from October 2nd, 1986, announcing that Calico had entered into a, quote, $62 million marketing agreement with Japanese toy maker Tomy Kogyo Co. End quote. So now in 1986, Tomy had already been selling their own toys along with other Japanese toys in North America. In fact, their sales was pretty substantial. Let me see if I can find the note here. Yeah, like $100 million. Okay, so they were not like just newbies with distributing in the USA. So this new agreement that was reported in the LA Times, it meant that not only would Calico purchase Tomy's subsidiaries in America, but also market Tomy toys under the Tomy name, which explains why we don't really hear about Calico in conjunction with Tomy toys. They kept the well-known Japanese name on the box. So this LA Times article alone doesn't prove or disprove a Sylvanian Families' presence in America in 1986. But it did lead me to two other bits of data that eventually convinced me of a concrete arrival date that I could believe in. The first of these was, if you can believe it, an American trademark database. Yes, I went through a bunch of online databases. This is how bad my curiosity had gotten. Anyway, I found one entry that stated, and I'm going to quote this, so let me find it on my notes here. Yes, here it is. It says, on Friday, January 31st, 1986, Epic Company Limited filed a U.S. federal trademark application for Sylvanian Families trademark, end quote. The trademark filing, really makes me think that Epic was sort of taking the necessary legal steps to bring Sylvanian Families to America. They were doing the footwork. And remember, this is January 1986. And then later that year in October is when you then get that LA Times article about Calico acquiring Tomy. So that article then led me to another news story. And this one was published in January 1987 by United Press International. And it's basically a report on Calico's money troubles. According to this January 1987 article, it seems like Calico's deal with Tomy, which had literally just been reported only 3 months before, well, this deal was perhaps one of the many Hail Mary efforts, we'll call them, by Calico to try to save themselves, basically, from bankruptcy. Calico was really hoping these new Japanese toys might just save them. But for us, anyway, the important takeaway of this article is actually at the very end of it. And I'm also, again, going to pull it up here and read directly from it, because it was really interesting when I read, as far as clearing up some of what was happening at the time. And remember, this is published in January 1987. Here it is. And it reads, quote, Calico plans to introduce a talking Cabbage Patch Kid doll in 1987 and other new products through its purchase in October of Tomy USA, the U.S. subsidiary of Tomy Kogyo of Japan. Calico's purchase of Tomy USA gave the Connecticut company, and by the way they're referencing Calico, first option to market Tomy products in the United States and Canada. New boys' action toys, tentatively dubbed U.S. Space Force, and a line of small animal families called Sylvanian Families will debut in 1987. End quote. Sorry, I got a little excited there at the end. But there you have it. There you have it. Calico was planning to, quote, debut, right, the Sylvanian Families in 1987. I seriously almost fell out of my chair when I got to that information at the end when I first read the article. And so that detail, along with the 1986 trademark filing, can only mean that these toys did not exist on the American market in 1985. Like, at least not in any official way. And yes, at some point, when I eventually get the time, I will go and edit the Wikipedia page and the fandom wiki. I don't know. Maybe it will already be changed by the time you hear this. But this history must be preserved for other obscure toy history nutcases in the world. Okay. I've got to have another drink to calm myself down. Here. Okay, so by the way, unfortunately, even the fantastic cuteness of Sylvanian Families could not save Calico. By 1988, despite the Sylvanian figures literally appearing on their Toy Fair catalog cover that year, Calico had at least $540 million in debts listed, and they filed for bankruptcy. Eventually, in 1989, Hasbro purchased most of Calico's assets, including at least some of Tommy's products. But as far as I can tell, Hasbro never touched the Sylvanians, and apparently most of Tommy's distribution rights were bought back by Tommy themselves. This is maybe why there's so much murkiness in the first few years of Sylvanian history in North America. Everything was so convoluted and complicated by the fact that a failing and soon to be bankrupt and bought out company was involved with launching them. And I'm not gonna lie, kind of makes me irritated because I feel like the toy deserved better. But before we move on to the 90s in America, let's look at the comparably more positive things across the pond, where another new Tommy outpost, Tommy UK, began distributing the toy. So, Sylvanian Families were killing it in those first few years in the UK. In fact, they win Toy of the Year from the British Toy Retailers Association in not only their debut year of 1987, but also in 1988 and 1989. In the years directly previous, in 1985 and 86, the Toy of the Year award was won by Transformers Optimus Prime, okay? And then directly after, in the years of 1990 and 91, the award was won by a Bandai Ninja Turtle toy. And then, it was a Nintendo Game Boy, okay? So this kind of gives you the idea, or an idea of how big the Sylvanian Families must have been to be sort of swinging it with the big boys, pretty much. It was also during this time that a true gem of this toy line was released. A 4-episode stop-motion animation called Stories of the Sylvanian Families. Now we're going to take a significant side quest here because, number one, I love stop-motion animation. But number two, I just really feel like this animation doesn't get talked about more. This animation was released in 1988. And while you can hunt down VHS copies of the show on eBay, there might be a DVD version. I'm not quite sure. I think I remember reading that somewhere. You can find all 4 episodes on YouTube, and I'll definitely include a link in the show notes. And let me tell you, if you are a Sylvanian fan, you gotta go watch this show. Please don't let the original Deke animation cartoon put you off. The two are barely related. Like, I think that the only thing that connects them is that they both have Sylvanian Families in the name, and they feature talking animals. A little side note also on our side quest here regarding the original 2D animation. According to what I've found online, this cartoon was quite popular overseas, especially in the UK and apparently Spain. It's always these two countries who are mentioned in regards to the popularity of the cartoon. And perhaps there could be like a lot of 40-year-old British people who have found memories, dear. They have really good memories, basically, that are near and dear to their heart of this original animation. And I suppose the popularity of the original animation might have helped, even in a small way, to drive demand that eventually led to a stop motion animation. So perhaps I ought to be grateful to the original cartoon, even if I, don't personally find it particularly memorable. But then again, on the Japanese Wikipedia article for Sylvanian Families, it says that the stop motion animation, or quote unquote puppet animation, is how Google translates it anyway, that this animation was planned in 1985 with the intention, of course, of promoting Sylvanian families, but specifically in foreign markets. So perhaps the stop motion one was being worked on even before the Deke animation 2D cartoon. Perhaps all of these things were kind of just happening simultaneously. I don't know. But who cares about all that? Let's talk about this stop motion animation. Each episode was animated with what looked like the actual toys and play sets. And man, seeing the original deluxe country house playset as an actual set piece, and the little brown bear family, or as they were called in the UK at the time, the Timbertop family, it's just kind of magical. I don't think this show was ever shown in America, and to be honest, I'm not really sure what my young self would have thought. As a kid, I was very familiar with other stop motion animations, Gumby, for example, or the 1960s Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, which, fun fact, was produced by an American company but animated in Japan. Well, these were all the things that my mom grew up with and then readily passed on to me. So I'd like to think that I would have enjoyed the Sylvanian stories, but if I'm being totally honest, it's perhaps the appeal or sort of the quiet nature of them might have been lost on me. Of course, watching it now, I find the stop motion animation incredibly charming. It has some 1983 stop motion Wind in the Willows vibes that I really love, especially the episode in winter. You can see the original country cottage and also the treehouse playset covered in fake snow and white paint. They just look so different from their factory look, and yet recognizable and super whimsical and sweet. The tiny winter clothes, like knitted sweaters and hats. Oh my gosh, it really satisfies my inner miniaturist. Yes. Okay, so I might be going on a little long about this nearly 40-year-old animation that has almost sank into obscurity, even amongst Sylvanian Families collectors. But please just indulge me for like one more minute, because I really need to get this off my chest. Just get it out of my system, because I'm not sure that my husband can handle me telling him any more obscure Sylvanian facts. But my favorite episode is the one where Grandmother Pearl, who's a rabbit from the Babblebrook family, she is super keen to bring her homemade moonshine to a picnic. And wait, hold on a second. It's not actually moonshine. This is just what I call it to myself. Let me check here. Yes, oh, that's right. Strawberry champagne. Okay, so Grandma wants to bring her homemade champagne, and her daughter, Crystal Babblebrook, is a bit stressed because, Grandma sucks at cooking, and she is obviously not confident that this strawberry champagne is actually drinkable. Anyway, the episodes are like 10 minutes long a piece, and I just love that they devote like an entire subplot to Grandma's questionable moonshine.
"I'll take some of my strawberry champagne," said Grandmother Pearl. Mother Crystal tried not to groan. Grandmother Pearl was the worst cook in Sylvania.
You'll have to watch the animation to find out what happens to those bottles that Grandma insists on bringing to the picnic. I actually found these stop-motion animations so charming that I watched them all 4 times each in about a span of a week, which might not sound like a lot, but I didn't watch any of the other animations from Sylvanian Families nearly as many times. And as a wife and a mom and like a working person, I don't have an incredible amount of spare time to blow, and I just feel like this says something about the quality and the whimsy baked into this animation. An animation that is made with essentially just the toys and basic set dress to the Sylvanian universe. It's pretty incredible what they did to bring the Sylvanian world to life. I really do think that this animation is one of the best things to come out of the Sylvanian Families toy line. Even if, yes, it's essentially just a giant commercial for the figures and playsets. Or maybe I'm just a sucker for stop motion, you know? Or, I don't know, maybe my fixation on these little animals is growing. Maybe my love for them is growing. There was just no way that I could talk about the UK life of this toy line in the 80s without kind of making a big deal about this show. So I just want to say kudos to Epic and kudos to the British Animation Studio, Filmfare, and also Joe and Martin Pullen, who directed it, and the amazing Bernard Cribbins, who does all of the narration. You know, I'm here, like nearly 40 years later, totally enjoying their work.
The Sylvanian families live here, in our land now. But whenever it's quiet, and there's nobody except them to hear, they all settle down for a Sylvanian story time.
Okay, so we really must get back to the main campaign here and move on to 1992 in the UK. The world's only independent Sylvanian shop opens in North London, commonly known as Sylvanian Storekeepers. If you are a fan, I'm sure you've seen the pictures of either the original blue facade or the white and green that came later, and also, of course, the big window of displays. By the way, sadly, the shop closed in 2023 after the owners retired, although there is still an extensive online shop run by, I think it's their daughter. There are tons of news articles about the closing of this iconic shop. I'll link to a couple in the show notes. But we, again, can't talk about the early life of this toy in the UK without mentioning this shop. In fact, Sylvanian Storekeepers had been involved in a way even since the year before in 1991, when the owners began managing the iconic Sylvanian Families token collectors scheme for Tomy UK. There were collector's tokens on all Sylvanian family pack boxes. So you would open the box, and usually one of the flaps would have a number and the Sylvanian Families logo. You would save these, similar to saving like box tops from cereal boxes, which was quite prevalent in America at the time. You would then mail them in, along with money for shipping and handling, of course. And in return, you would get exclusive sets and other paraphernalia. Oh my gosh, like, for example, the awesome 1988 stop-motion animation series. That's right, a VHS featuring all 4 of the animations could have been yours for like 50 tokens. So, although Sylvanians were initially designed by Epic to appeal to Japanese kids stuck in concrete high-rise box apartments, British kids completely latched on, like immediately. Or, I don't know, maybe their parents did. Tomy's former UK managing director, his name is Peter Brown, He saw the Sylvanian families at the Tokyo Toy Fair in 1986, and he immediately loved them and wanted to bring them to the UK. And he commented that the appeal of the Sylvanian families basically lies in their quaint, old sort of Englishness and the values that you were associated with family life. So, yeah, that definitely sounds like parents being nostalgic, basically. But what I said earlier, I think is still true. Sylvanians had an appeal all on their own. They were unique, and they still are in many ways. Though they are, in fact, a toy basically targeted primarily at 4 to 8-year-olds, when compared to most of the toys for this age range, they are super high quality and full of detail, as we talked about. But not just that, each figure comes with a detailed backstory and are also crucially included in some kind of family unit. And as old-fashioned as that sounds, this was and still is the perfect launching point for most kids' imagination. It really allowed for most kids' imagination to really run wild. I know from previous experience as a teacher and also from my own kid that children really do love a certain amount of framing, a sort of safe, at least semi-recognizable place for them to then independently explore and go wild. I think the combo of nostalgia, quality, and also detail, and the possibility of open-ended and creative and flexible play is what did it for the kids and the parents of the past. And I honestly think that it's still what works for kids today. And what about adults? The older collectors. Who are these people? Who are the people buying this little figure in 2025? Before we answer that question, we really need to cover the other big topic when it comes to Sylvanians, which is, what in the heck happened in the 90s? What are Calico Critters? Are they really the same thing? Is this just a case of regional marketing? I mean, it's not uncommon to have different names for what is essentially the same toy marketed in different countries or regions. There is a huge teen and adult collector community in North America, and many of them new collectors who have only started in the last few years. So now that we've sort of solved the mystery of the Sylvanian North American arrival date, and we've also reviewed the successes in the UK in the early days, I think it's now time to really understand what happened to the name of this toy in the 90s. Okay, so yes, name changes to toys happen all the time. You don't often hit a bullseye on the first try. And even in Japan, Sylvanian families were apparently first called, and hold on, I'm going to again just bring up my specific notes so I can get this right. This is the rough Google translation, of course, but the original name was apparently Pleasant Friends of the Forest Epic System Collection Animal Toy Sylvanian Families. Okay, now I will say I have yet to find a primary source for this original name. Even on the Japanese Wikipedia page, there is no citation. But I just love imagining the person at Epic deciding that Sylvanian Families was probably a bit more catchy than something 12 words long. I just wish I knew at exactly what point they decided to simplify the name. Perhaps they had always planned to. I don't know. Still, I would have loved to have been in that meeting. So now that we have the simplified Sylvanian Families, and right there we have the reference to the Latin word silva, meaning forest. And as the canon lore goes, the animal families live in a place called Sylvanian Village, which consists of homes and a town area and also a seaside region called Seabreeze Cape. This is all official. canon stuff. It's on their website. It's referenced in all their media, including stories and animations, everything. And I'll talk a bit more about this later. I mean, Sylvania seems like a super swell place to live. But wait, what about our dear Calico Critters in America? What about them? I mean, do they too live in a place called Sylvanian Village? So let's get on to this name change. Was it just your run-of-the-mill international business situation where different markets seem to call for different names? Although I can't be totally sure, I don't think this was the case, especially given that Epic had tried to debut them in America under the original name. So here we are, we're in the late 80s, and Calico has crumbled. Remember, Tomy purchases most of their North American distribution rights back, and in 1988, Tomy America Inc. is reborn. There are many references on the internet which call out the year of 1993 as the year in which Sylvanian Families transitioned to Calico Critters in North America. In fact, originally, it was Calico Critters of Cloverleaf Corners, another sort of long name that the Japanese originally came up with. But the first point of change that I was able to find was another log in the American Trademark Database. That's right. This one was from September of 1990, and it states that the status for the Sylvanian Families trademark had changed to voluntary surrender of registration. 1990, okay? This would have been the period of time when Epic was still dealing with the fallout from the Calico bankruptcy case. This was probably when Tomy was still settling which rights they were going to get back and which were going to Hasbro. These types of legal and business issues, they often take years of negotiating. So it isn't surprising that it's finally in 1992 that Tomy America then files for a trademark of Calico Critters of Cloverleaf Corners. And they are granted that trademark in 1993. Also, a little side note here that many of the boxes from this era do change from going from saying made in Taiwan to then saying made in China. And then they also began showing the dates of 1985 and 1993. Literally it has that 1985 ampersand 1993 next to the Epic name. However, if you are keeping up with the dates, you are probably wondering, well, what the heck was going on with Sylvanian Families in America during that transition time, say from late 1988 or 89 through 1992? As far as hard public evidence, there is slim to none. Many corporations who file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in America, like Calico did, will continue operating, sort of in the hopes that the debt restructuring will save them. Did Calico attempt this in any meaningful way? And if they did, were Calico Critters involved? Were any being produced? It's interesting that the fandom wiki does claim that 7 different sets were released in the US during this sort of mystery time period. However, the list does have quite a few inconsistencies if you then compare the information found on the fandom wiki individual family pages. But let's just look at the names that I was able to find anyway of the US releases. This is from about 1988 to 1992. We have the Waters family, which are beavers, in 1988. The Chestnut family, the raccoon version, in 1988. And the Treefellow family, who are owls, also in 1988. Then you have the Underwood family, who are badgers, in 1989. The Hoppenset family, who are rabbits, in 1988 or 89. And these are the same little animals. They're called the corn tops in the UK. The Huntington family, who are honey bears, came in 1990. And they were just called like the honey bear family, I believe, in the UK. And then the last one I was able to find is your favorite, I'm sure, and mine, for their sort of chronically surprised faces and their fantastic color, which is the bulrush family, who are frogs, in 1991. And actually, just so you know, no shade at all, I love these little frog guys. And maybe that's just because I just like love frogs in general. And also these are like one of the few that I can easily distinguish from the other critters. So what this list means is that at least some people claim that 7 sets were released in America during these years. Now, it's hardly anything, yes, if you look at the numbers of Japan and UK releases, which is closer to like 30. So comparatively, there was very little going on in America. And in fact, I was able to find no sets at all listed for 1992. I've been able to find pictures of all of these in their blue and green American style Sylvanian Families packaging, except for the bulrush family, the frogs. These guys I've only seen in early Calico Critters packaging. But, hang on a second, wasn't the Calico trademark not granted until 1993? So how did the bulrush frogs come out in 1991? Did they actually release under the original Sylvanian Families name, even though the trademark was given up the year before in 1990? Or perhaps they were released under the Calico name, but maybe before the trademark was finalized? I don't know. Please, if someone has what they think is an original American release in box, I need to see detailed pictures, because it would truly help solve this mystery that I have not been able to find any publicly available answer. And actually, I hate to tell you this, but that 1988 to 1992 time period is actually even murkier than all of this mess, because on the Japanese Wikipedia page for Sylvanian Families, it's actually claimed that Epic literally exited the US and Canadian market, and then formally re-entered sometime in 1993. There is one citation for this claim on Japanese Wikipedia, and that's for an article in the Nikkei Business Daily Journal from January of 1993. Unfortunately, either due to my poor, nearly non-existent Japanese skills, or just because this article doesn't exist on the internet, I was not able to find the original article, but I was able to translate the article's title, which reads, "Epic re-enters US and Canada with toys for girls and teams up with US Tomy subsidiary." So yes, that's from the Nikkei Business Daily Journal. According to this, along with the coverage of the Calico bankruptcy case, I just kind of my suspicion is that there was some complication about which distribution rights Tomy was able to buy back. I found at least one reference to Hasbro, who was the company who bought most of Calico's assets, continuing to distribute some Tomy products through their Play School line. Which ones? Who knows? And my guess is that the voluntary release of the Sylvanian Families' American trademark and the reintroduction of them had something to do with Calico failing, and Tomy America having to reestablish themselves and take over their rights again. Many on the internet claim that there was some kind of lawsuit. I've read stories about conflicts with the electronics brand Sylvania, but I haven't been able to find definitive evidence for this. The only thing I see is that it was just like a big old mess after the bankruptcy. Like it seems like Sylvanian Families was then basically forced to make a completely fresh start in the coming decade of the 90s. And maybe there was just some trademark complication between Calico and Hasbro and Tomy. Either way, Sylvanian Families were ready for a rebirth come the new decade. And as a part of that rebirth was the new Calico Critters of Cloverleaf Corner's name. Another quick reminder or side quest, because I think it's important to constantly keep this in mind. This is a crazy time in the toy industry. These were some of the biggest companies competing and negotiating and fighting with one another about who would end up with what rights. This was happening again and again. As companies like came and went and expanded, experimented, and licensed, won and lost. And unfortunately, our fine furry friends just kind of got caught up in it, along with a lot of other toys. Please, somebody make a movie about this era, because I would seriously watch it in a heartbeat. I thought the movie Blackberry was awesome, and I would just love a movie just like that, except about toys in the 80s. Yes, please and thank you. Holy moly, y'all. We've finally made it to the 90s, maybe even the mid-90s, and small, fuzzy, anthropomorphic animal toys continue on their wild, bumpy ride through the world. Sylvanian Families, though, was struggling a bit. And not just from distributor bankruptcies and supposed lawsuits. They had competition. But before we talk about this competition, we better take a quick snack break, because this is a picnic after all. For food, I decided on some more classically Japanese, as we are talking about a Japanese company and a Japanese toy after all. So first up, I'm going to eat an onigiri. This one apparently has chicken inside, which I've never had before, but found at my local Asian market. So let's open it up. Okay. There we go. Lost a little bit of the nori, but all right, give this a try. Wow. The seaweed is actually super crunchy, which doesn't always happen when you get these like pre-made onigiri. So cool. All right. So let's get cracking talking about the competition that Sylvanian Families had. Does anyone remember the Mapletown anime? Tonka in North America acquired the license to the Japanese cartoon in 1986, and basically then went about creating, you guessed it, small flocked anthropomorphic animal figurines. Reading through the Japanese Sylvanian Families Wikipedia entry again, it seems like the rise of other similar toys did actually cause a huge decline in Sylvanian sales. It was becoming a crowded market, and many of these, like Mapletown, along with, by the way, others like Forest Families, which was created by, I think, a German company, just often it was difficult for consumers to distinguish all of these from Sylvanian Families. There were a lot of small flocked animal figures, and once again, I could probably do an entire separate episode. Maybe I'll do that because I do have a lot to say on the differences and variations. But there's just like too much, and we really have to move on. Like, are we ever even going to get into the new millennium? But I will say this quick bit. The Mapletown anime is actually quite good. The subtle but kind of amazing similarities to the Sailor Moon anime, and also the hilarious but like super cozy live action book ending segments in the English dubbed version. Oh my gosh, all this is quite great. There's a lot to unpack, but alas, we must shove on.
Share the Mapletown adventures of Patty Rabbit and Bobby Bear with someone you love. I'll be looking forward to our next visit together because Mapletown is my favorite place to be.
It's important to note now that the 80s through the 90s were quite a tricky time for toy companies in Japan. For Japan in general, the 1990s are often considered the lost decade after the economic bubble of 1989. Though Tomy had many divisions and subsidiaries operating around the world, it was ultimately a Japanese company who was struggling with, trying to juggle all of their many assets and licenses, some of which were failing, along with a declining toy industry because of their aging population, and along with the economic downturns. So next to all of this were huge manufacturing changes happening in Asia. The economic miracle in Taiwan during the second half of the 20th century brought many large and small factories to the island. In fact, the early Sylvanians were manufactured in Taiwan, as were many other popular toys like Barbie and action figures and a variety of like sporting equipment and licensed things like Ghostbusters skateboards. I don't know. But the Taiwanese middle class was growing through the decades, of course, and which meant wages were rising. And predictably, by the 1990s, many factory operations moved to mainland China. And well, we all know what happened to manufacturing in China after that, right? It really took over. So yeah, a lot was going on, and all of these changes in economy and industry can really take up a lot of a company's time. Like, I cannot imagine the hours of payroll that it took to get a handle on it all, while still producing and releasing tons of toy sets. Perhaps the amount of money spent didn't really totally come back as revenue. According to a couple of collectors in the USA, by the mid-1990s, you could find Sylvanian Families branded toys in the clearance section of Toys R Us. But what about across the pond? The English Wikipedia page, at least as of, like I said, summer 2025, claims that the toy was discontinued in the UK by the late 1990s. However, this page is admittedly, once again, not well cited and kind of a bit of a mess in some parts. And there's no actual citation for this formal discontinuation. And while it seems like discontinuation could technically be true, if you look at the wiki along with there's a history album produced by the London-based Sylvanian Families shop. And on there, it says that nearly 20 sets were released between 1993 and 2000. Okay. And I'm just looking at these sets here. There are a lot of amazing releases during this supposed kind of downturn bad time, right? Like the Sylvanian Families Little World line came out in 1996, which the Little World line is basically Sylvanian miniatures for your Sylvanian figures. Yes, miniatures. I think I need them. I really, really need them. Then after that, in 1997, there's the Wadlington Duck family, the Norwood Mouse family, so cute. There's also a figure set called Grandma's Coffee Break. seems to be a set featuring our good friend, Grandma Moonshine, in a rocking chair with a side table and a mug and a wee plate of cookies. I need this. Oh my gosh, Grandma Moonshine Babblebrook just might be my spirit animal. I might actually cosplay as her someday. I can totally imagine it. I'd be like the version of her with this set, with the mug and cookies, and I could go to cons and hand out cookies to everyone. Anyway, back on track with these sets that released during this sort of a bad time. 1998, you have the Beagle family that came out, as well as the bakery set. Oh my gosh, so cute. One of my favorites for sure. It's just crazy because if you look at the publicly available record, everyone just kind of states this fact that, it was just this decline of the 1990s. But if you look what was actually coming out, there were still plenty of amazing figures and sets being released. I think this is where the complexities of the toy business comes into play, because you can have a discontinued line, but still have a lot of the product circulating, especially in the instance where the product is an imported one with different versions and produced in multiple locations. The famous Sylvanian Families shop imported and sold versions from both America and Japan, so maybe their history albums weren't just tracking what Tomy UK was doing, but maybe they were tracking also what's being released around the world. I've been able to hunt down a couple of articles referencing Tomy, quote, cutting its losses and stopping production in the UK altogether, end quote. I mean, it seems as though there definitely was a formal discontinuation. But of course, they're not still discontinued, so what happened? Well, here comes Peter Brown. Wait, Peter Brown, yes, don't we know that name? Yes, he was Tomy UK's previous managing director. In fact, he was the one who established the UK branch after he saw the company's huge successes initially in America with, many, many other toys. And years later, in fact, I think it was 15 years later, and after dabbling with another company for a few years, he starts a company called Flair Leisure Products. And 18 months after Tomy UK gives up Sylvanian Families, Peter Brown is bringing the toy line back under Flair. I'll talk about Flair in a few minutes, but I think it's crucial to underscore that while there seems to have been a formal discontinuation, given that it was so short and that Peter Brown was involved with both Tomy UK and Flair, I doubt there was much of a disruption to your average consumer, or at least most of them. The brand had been lagging, a bit sickly, maybe, sure, but the famous shop stayed open. Indeed, according to one article, their business was booming, if only because for a little while their shop was the only place you could easily find the toy. In fact, if you look at this article, it was actually kind of like an interview from 10 years ago. The president and CEO of Epic, Michihiro Maeda, he says that during this time, the late 90s, the company actually really struggled with expanding internationally. Maeda, whose father Takatora Maeda, he founded the company in 1958. He goes on to say that part of the problem was simply just product pipeline, communicating with the factories, first in Taiwan and then later in Hong Kong. It was so difficult just them knowing how many injection machines they needed or employees at any given time. It was super difficult. They also, as we've now learned, heavily relied on third-party distributors from the beginning and then throughout the 90s and into the 2000s. This meant that it was very hard for Epic to develop and control the different marketing strategies. Now, spoiler alert, this would all change radically in 2008. But let's not get ahead of ourselves for like the millionth time. We are still in 1999 now, looking toward the new millennium, and big changes are afoot. Tomy has given up on Sylvanians in the UK, and no surprise here, Tomy America has also given up our furry little Calico Critters of Cloverleaf Corners. Flair and Peter Brown swoop in and save the day in the UK, and in America, the toys get picked up by International Playthings LLC, which is a toy company started in 1967. So maybe this means that things are looking up for Sylvanian families nearing the millennium. I mean, yeah, sure. The world was like losing its mind because, oh my God, Y2K, we better stock up on canned goods and paper towels and bottled water. And if you're rich enough, dig a nuclear fallout bunker. Yes, people did this. Not my family, but we definitely stocked up our cupboards with tons of canned food. I remember this. I mean, this is the reality of where we are, in the timeline. This was what was going on. And yet things were actually looking up in Japan. All right, so I want to talk about Sylvanian families at the turn of the century in Japan for a few minutes, because there were tons of new products and side projects happening in the late 90s, including a restaurant to celebrate the toy line's 15th anniversary. In fact, beginning in 1999 and into the year 2000, there were several special anniversary releases. I mean, we should probably do just a little side quest here about dates, by the way. So the toy's official launch in Japan was 1985. But like most toys and other consumer products, there was a bit of a preview in the previous year. And for Sylvanian families, it was apparently at the 1984 Tokyo Toy Show. So maybe this is why they began celebrating the 15th anniversary in 1999. Or perhaps they were just trying to stretch out the anniversary promotion for as long as possible, especially since they sort of now seem to be in such like a better place, basically success-wise, than they were during their 10th anniversary in the mid-90s. Either way, we should really thank Historical Epic for going all out at this time, because the sets released during this roughly 2-year time period from about like 1999 to 2001 are fantastic. My favorite is the Japanese Summer Festival set, which was part of their Anniversary Carnival series. And some of the figures in this set, they wear traditional festival wear, like the hoppy coats and the hachimaki headbands. Oh my gosh, I really need these figures. Like, I just looking at them, I can practically taste the shaved ice from those summer festival carts. It's just, they're so adorable. Now, I will say, as of mid-2025, these aren't impossible to get your hands on, as long as you're willing to order from a Japanese seller and also be willing to drop like $100. Yeah, no joke. Now, lest you think that the Sylvanian world in 1999 was confined to figures and play sets and a couple of animations, let's look at some significant developments that fall outside these categories. And the first one is quite seminal. Can you even say quite seminal? The first one was seminal. It's the first Sylvanian restaurant. As far as I could find, the original restaurant was called the Sylvanian Forest Kitchen. And it opened in 1999. And then closed 12 years later into, I think it was 2011. But fear not, other eateries have since opened, so don't worry, you haven't missed your chance to eat a Freya-themed omurice, or, I don't know, a cheeseburger bun with cat ears. Yes, of course, this original restaurant had plenty of themed food, but also, just like at the later restaurants that opened, there was often a character show where a Sylvanian character would come out and do a bit of a dance. Okay, yeah. Can I be honest here? Like, is this a safe space? Because I ain't gonna lie. The video footage that I've seen of this is actually a bit horrifying, including a video that I saw from apparently the original restaurant. After watching these videos, I definitely now know that I prefer my Sylvanians to be small and not with long human fingers. I have no idea why this bothers me so much, but as a child, I might have been screaming my head off when the character came out. Anyway, beyond offering customers the unique experience of eating at a Japanese-themed cafe, there was also a little store in the restaurant where quite a few exclusive restaurant figures and sets were sold. These sets usually had special packaging, and from what I could find, most of the boxes were green with sort of this food motif around the edges and a little gray rabbit chef mascot. So cute. I love the original kitchen restaurant set. It's probably my favorite out of all of those that I was able to find, which I love it. It includes a building where half of it is like the kitchen section and the other half is a dining section for customers. There are big windows with like these lace curtain detail printed on the window panes, and there's an awning over the entry that says Sylvanian Kitchen, and there are tiny menus and dining placemats and of course foods. And wow, this looking over at the can, this really matches my drink. It's definitely got that classic cream, brown, and green color scheme. As a kid, yeah, this like would have blown my mind. Like to eat at the restaurant and then before heading home, stop in at the shop and get an actual play set of the restaurant. I would have kind of lost my head in excitement, and it would have totally made up for the fact that I had been like traumatized by the long-fingered monstrosities minutes before. You know, this playset, like, it kind of reminds me of a better version of those McDonald's playsets that used to be made. Do they even still make those? I have no idea, but that's what this kitchen restaurant set reminds me of, except, well, as I said, like 1,000 times cuter. Oh, and one last note on the restaurant. It actually was not really like a collaboration. It was owned and managed by Epic themselves, which is pretty amazing given that this company was for many years mostly known for video game consoles and video games. You know what? Speaking of Epic's video games, it was also in 1999 that they began releasing their Sylvanian Families games for the Game Boy Color. Yes, you heard me right. There are Sylvanian Families video games. Epic was basically going back to its roots. The first, an RPG called Sylvanian Families: The Fairyland Pendant, looks like an absolute banger. I mean, you play as Aster Dandelion, and it is your job to return a lost magical fairy pendant. I mean, just go find like the opening screen to this game, and when you see that the whole story starts with some misty forest fairies, you know you are in for a treat. And actually, we need to take a bit of a side quest here and talk about these fairy figures, because I don't think I've mentioned the Sylvanian Families Misty Forest family figures yet. I think for a long time during my research, I actually kind of avoided looking at them because my mind couldn't comprehend what these things were. I think like part of the issue is that other than the very first fairy figures released in 1988, these little dolls don't come with clothes. So kind of right away they stand out. The other way that they stand out is that they don't really have a discernible animal shape. Their face is sort of like this ambiguous mixture of a modern otter figure along with sort of like a that has that like semi-jarring baldness of the Sylvanian meerkat figure. do have little molded wings, although the original 80s figures, I believe the wings were cloth. But these little figures are depicted in a variety of positions, including this sort of like flying position, which really just kind of looks like it's sliding on its stomach, like sort of like slip inside style. This particular one is featured quite a lot in the game. Anyway, apparently in the Sylvanian lore, the fairies can only be seen by the children of Sylvania, and their homeland is the Misty Forest, which is, according to various toy releases, the Misty Forest is then divided into 4 different themed lands. There's Natureland, Fantasyland, they have a Candyland, and also it's a Clouds Land. These sets really run the gamut as far as design, like from intensely like pastel, and frankly, those pieces are a bit like generic, like the fairy castle, all the way to there's some really zany designs. Personally, my favorite one is the Tomato House in Natureland, and also the Candy Gingerbread House. I mean, by now, okay, you know that I love a good food theme. So, anyway, there's that. Back to the video games. There would eventually be 5 more of these RPGs made, and the last 3 moved to Game Boy Advanced. None of these games ever got a release outside Japan, which at this point in our story is probably not surprising at all. Although you can find a couple of them patched in English floating around on the internet. If you are a fan, they're definitely worth checking out. I actually still have my original Game Boy Color, and I'm not gonna lie, even though the original games are all in Japanese, I have glanced at a couple of eBay listings. But honestly, it would be like a little unhinged of me to first buy an old foreign Game Boy game before buying like an actual figure. But anywho, people, let's get the heck out of the 90s, shall we? Because a new era for Sylvanian families is beginning to form. My fine friends, we finally reached Y2K, and things are about to get wild. We don't just have new overseas distributors, but also new animes coming, new video games, new musical attractions, and of course, lots of new figures and sets. It's during this time that we also get some interesting handmade, extremely limited release buildings in Japan. For example, apparently there was a pink-roofed wooden dollhouse. I think that was what it was actually called, pink-roofed wooden dollhouse. It was released in the fall of 2003, and only 5 were made. Or another example, there was a handmade house that had a hand-cranked built-in music box, and only 7 of those were made, apparently, and sold at a store in Ichikawa in 2002. There is very little evidence of these types of releases on the internet, very, very little. And I had to search deep on the Japanese web to find anything more than a fuzzy, like low-res picture and a few guesses or claims. Honestly, someday I could do yet another whole episode on these rare Japanese releases. Anyway, now, although a lot was happening with the brand in Japan, and well, pretty much all over the world in various countries, it's really quite impossible to talk about the 2000s with any significance without first talking about Flair in the UK. This is because between Flair and also the Sylvanian Shopkeepers, the London-based store, a lot of iconic and currently highly sought after sets were created during this time. Indeed, for many collectors, at least in the West, the 2000s were considered somewhat of a golden age. Although you'd, of course, find plenty of people who would argue that the true golden age was the 90s. I mean, there's no end of admirers for the UK exclusive Harvester restaurant or the Meadowcroft cottage. Although the golden age opinion schism definitely seems to rely on a collector's age and also aesthetic leanings. But still, you'd be hard-pressed to find a fan or a creator that doesn't have some beloved sets or figures that Flair developed. So let's take an important side quest through the land of Flair. Flair Leisure Products PLC Public Limited Company was incorporated on the 22nd of January in 1999. And they really seem to have carved out a special place within the Sylvanian universe during their reign. They designed and introduced iconic British sets. I mean, that amazing Morris Minor family car, especially the deep green one, which I think is the original one. Oh, so great. Or what about the Woodland bus? And later the two bus conductors named Stan and Olive, who are named after two characters in the British television show On the Buses. I mean, like, what a nice local touch to be so thoughtful with the names. Also, a little side note on the names here that I haven't yet explicitly mentioned, that up until recently, only a few years ago, the characters in Japan actually had no names. For example, in the first game, it wasn't Aster Dandelion trying to return the fairy pendant. It was a, quote, female ivory rabbit, end quote, from the, quote, ivory rabbit family, end quote. Later, the figure was given a name in the UK when Tomy UK released a version of her in the 90s. But then, during the Flair era, Flair released their own version later, and then, called the family the Butterglove family, and Aster turned into Beverly, Beverly Butterglove. This is just one small example of why collecting and understanding this toy can be so difficult or overwhelming, or at the very least, for a curious person like me, so interesting and even fascinating. Every figure and set seems to have some mysterious or curious past. This little side note will definitely come up again later when we talk about Epic's push to consolidate control. And speaking of brand control, Flair actually had a lot of design autonomy during this time. And that autonomy is kind of a double-edged sword for Epic. Because on the one hand, it truly seemed to help grow the brand and solidify Sylvanian Families as a staple amongst a lot of British kids. It's important to remember that kids were really playing with these things. Sure, yes, they were collecting them in a way, but most kids were just being kids. They were sitting on the ground or on their bed and letting their imaginations go somewhere else while they held the figures and moved them around and made little voices. As I've mentioned before, these toys had a perfect blend of the familiar and the fantastical, and I think that familiar Britishness of the Flair era also really appealed to the parents, who were obviously largely the ones buying these things in the first place. And a lot of the Flair pieces just seemed to have really dialed up the comfort of this toy. Okay, if we're going to talk about Flair and their autonomy and about kids actually playing with these figures, I suppose I better at least mention the grippy hands. That's right, we're going to talk about toy hands. Dang, this episode is really peaking right at this moment. Okay, so some, or at least one of the biggest differences with the figures that came out during the Flair era was the change to the hand mold. The Flair figures had a hand that was curved and could grip items, like utensils, tiny crayons or pencils, etc. Apparently, Flair liked these new hands because they improved the playability of the toy. There are, of course, a lot of opinions on the internet about which hand is better. Most seem to like the look of the flat hand, but really enjoy the handiness of the grippy hand, especially given that there are so many accessories, tiny, tiny little accessories that can be held. I don't know, like for example, a glass of grandma's moonshine. Anyway, these grippy hands, with very few exceptions, appeared on all of the Flair era figures. Now, apparently Epic in Japan was never wild about what they called the robot look of them. And that probably explains why we no longer see them on like the newly produced figures today. But what about you? Are you team grippy? Team flat? Personally, I'm going to stay out of the fray on that particular debate. Seriously, talking about Flair and all of the unique sets and figures they made, it could be its own episode. And I know I've probably said that now like 4 times, but the amount of recognizable and beloved sets that came out under Flair, it cannot be overstated, which is saying a lot given that this is once again a Japanese toy with plenty happening in Japan during this time. So, of course, I've got to take a little bit of time and talk about a few more of the releases, like the special Family Life accessories line that was released, or the re-releases of the Renard Fox family, or the Puddle for the Duck family, the Wildwood Brown Rabbit family. These were all coming out during this time with little changes and variants. Some were just like coming out in different structured families or with different clothes, or they included variations of different play sets that were, only ever found in the UK. All of these changes, some of them very small, piled up on top of each other to create sets and figures that were unique and special, which then have gone on to truly define an entire era of this toy. Of course, also Flair released plenty of nearly identical sets too. Flair typically released the Epic sets that were releasing in Japan about a year later. So it's not as if there was absolutely no communication with Epic, but I think because of Peter Brown's heavy involvement with Sylvanians in the UK through both Tomy and Flair itself, Flair was able to make a lot of their own design decisions. There must have been, I don't know, like a bit of trust there because of the history. And hey, apparently even some of those decisions made it back across to Japan. I mean, all you need to do is just look at the first ever elephant figures. Those were first released by Flair in 2010, and then later in other parts of the world, including Japan. Now, we need to talk about what was happening elsewhere in the world, like outside of Japan and the UK and the US. Despite the dominance of Flair, by the mid-2000s, things were also beginning to finally really happen elsewhere. While there had been small releases in the 80s and 90s, for example, like figures that were produced by companies like Gig or Giochi Preziosi in Italy. Super sorry for the bad pronunciation, by the way, of those Italian names. These releases must have been very limited because not much is known about them, although you can find some figures in interesting packaging floating around on the internet. Especially in mainland Europe, through a variety of distributors, there was a limited amount of Sylvanians in country-specific packaging released and continued to be released for at least a few years. For example, Tomy France released several products, including apparently an exclusive house, while Bisac released a range in Spain. Usually these figures were basically identical to those released in the UK, but often they were packaged together with different sets in a unique box. The Tommy France packaging in particular really screams early 2000s aesthetic, and although I was a teenager or a young adult by then, I am the eldest of 5 siblings, so I still have a strong nostalgic pull toward those color palettes. Oh, and of course, in Mexico in 2004, FM Toys, or Fotorama de Mexico Toy, began producing Sylvanians under the Lindos Ternurines name. Apparently, these ones seem to follow the Epic releases mostly, rather than the Flare releases, although sold in their own box with the Lindos Ternurines name. With most of the boxes, also, by the way, including the English Sylvanian Families name as well. Actually, let's talk about North America a bit more. Beyond Mexico kind of doing their own thing and following Epic, International Playthings, on the other hand, with Calico Critters, was covering the USA market as well as the Canadian market much of the time. And there is yet more confusion surrounding this because for a long time the American packaging and Canadian packaging had some differences, like the French being included on the Canadian boxes is probably the biggest one, and there's also different reference numbers. So in fact, if you look at Mexico and then the USA and Canada, things were quite a bit divided. However, spoiler alert again, this will change in the future as Epic's control grows. The 2000s in America is kind of a difficult time to sum up because you have both a new distributor and the new name being solidified, and a lot of inconsistencies in regards to figures and sets and names when compared to other countries. Calico Critters seem to be just doing their own thing. For example, probably the biggest example are new names. You probably aren't surprised to hear that there were lots of name changes. And of course, at this point, the entire toy line, is called something different from Sylvanian Families. So maybe it's not surprising that they would change plenty of the family names as well. For example, the Dale sheep family, although pretty much identical across all countries, with some exclusive figures in the UK and Japan, they are called the Lambrook sheep family in North America. Even Freya Chocolate, who's kind of our head honcho lady now, the Sylvanians, she is still called Belle Hopscotch in America. On top of all this, you have logo differences and packaging differences as well. The design direction of this era is quite unique and, dare I say, intensely Gen Z. One glance at this packaging and you can see why Gen Zers dress and design like they do. I'm convinced the saturated colors, the added sparkle detail, the quirky sort of curly fonts have totally played a part in Gen Z's foundational design language. Although I can't be sure, I suspect the International Playthings Calico Critters design team were highly influenced by other toy packaging. Just take one look at the Gen 3 My Little Pony logo, and then look at a lot of the fonts used on the Calico Critters packaging of this time, and it is hard to ignore the similarities. Not that, of course, that the Flare packaging wasn't also striking, especially that design with sort of the grass and the blue sky with the clouds. I mean, it was very Windows XP of them, for sure. But the saturated magentas and the pinks and the greens of the Calico Critter boxes, I mean, they just practically blind my eyes and sear them into my memory with their sort of sheer intensity. For good or for ill, I will never forget those boxes. So once again, just talking about the regional differences could just be a whole separate podcast, but we really got to crack on once more. We've got to talk about the last important thing when it comes to international playthings, and that is this, that in 2008, they would be bought by Epic themselves. That's right. Epic bought the entire company. This purchase is considered a huge milestone by the company. Indeed, for them, it is like the true beginning of becoming a unified global brand. So let's finally close out this first decade of the millennium by running down all of the crazy stuff happening in Japan. All of that fun media stuff that was just like truly maneuvering the brand into the constant spotlight. Obviously, there were also plenty of special releases and new figures, but more importantly, there were more Game Boy games. Okay, I'm not sure if these were that important to like 99% of the people outside of Japan, but you know, it's important to me, and I probably like shouldn't waste any more time on these, but I'm just going to read through some of the names of these releases, just if only to entice you to go look up the game on YouTube. So right out of the gates in the year 2000, you get a music game, a sort of like a Sylvanian Guitar Hero. You also get a second RPG, Sylvanian Families Fantasy of the Rainbow Forest. A third one comes in 2001, Sylvanian Families Starry Night, or as some call it, Hourglass of the Wishing Stars. In 2002, the RPGs then, like I mentioned before, moved to the Game Boy Advanced, and you get Sylvanian Families Tapestry of Seasons. More would follow, basically one a year all the way until 2005, along with a music maker and a cartridge for the console, the Sega Pico. Just think, Sega Pico, it's a little bit much to call it a console, but anyway, they had a cartridge for that machine too. I mean, just think of the hours of Sylvanian Families animated gameplay awaiting for you on the internet. And speaking of animated stuff, in 2007, the first CGI animation series is released. And later, they're released with various dubbed and subbed versions, introducing yet more characters and names. These animations are, I'm going to be honest, I had a little bit of a hard time watching these animations more than once. Although the second episode features some super whimsical machines, for example, the wake-up machine or the auto-easy toothbrush machine, or the best one is the dialogue memorizer machine. And these machines are invented by Cedric the Squirrel, and they're all made of wood and brass, and I mean, like some serious steampunk vibes coming out of this. I would just like definitely be here for it, except it's just the chunky sort of lifeless style of the animation, which is super common for this era of CGI. It's just like too distracting for me. Basically, the charm, in my opinion, just isn't there. But then again, I'm not exactly in the prime demographic for these episodes, and I admittedly really just don't like this style of animation. It's just like much too VeggieTales in style for me to really truly enjoy it, especially when sort of the story and the dialogue is not great. It was probably the hot new thing, and this just sort of defined the era of animation in the first decade of the millennium. There were plenty of other franchises, Barbie, Care Bears, that also succumbed to this kind of animation. Apparently, there was supposed to be more than just 3 episodes of that original Sylvanian Families 2007 animation, but they were never released. Actually, one of the good things about these original animations is that the walnut squirrel family is featured a lot. And these little squirrel figures are some of the cutest and most recognizable for me, and very, very popular on the internet. Their bushy tails are great, and maybe it's just nice for me that I just immediately know that they're squirrels from the moment I look at them. And yes, okay, the babies don't have tails, but that's okay because it just makes them look like chipmunks. But, that is like totally not an issue at all. Sylvanian Families has released other squirrel families, by the way, but I think they really perfected the squirrely look with the walnut family. Not to mention the father, Cedric, his backstory and profession is really fun and unique, and it was at least enjoyable to see this shine a bit in the animations. The Walnut family was in fact released in 2004 to celebrate the franchise's 20th anniversary. And it was in that same year, during the summer, that Epic opened its first theme park attraction, Sylvanian Village, located inside the Greenpa Amusement Park in the Shizuoka Prefecture. This would be the first of several attractions and is still open to this day with some changes over the years. Greenpa is more or less mostly known for the Sylvanian Families characters at this point, as well as some Ultraman attractions, including a restaurant, which I think is a really hilarious mashup of characters. But if I'm being honest, the best thing about this park, at least based on the YouTube videos that I watched, is actually the non-Sylvanian ninja maze, where you go through obstacles and collect stamps as you go. Although I will admit that the Sylvanian Families cottages at the Pika campground at the park look super cute, and I'd probably try to rent one if I was going to Greenpa. Or maybe I would stay at the tent campsite, one of which has a big saffron walnut character attached to the tent's decking. From what I can tell, this park looks interesting enough if you have small children who love the toy, but honestly, a lot looks like it is in desperate need of a refresher. There's peeling paint and tired-looking furniture and games and landscaping that has the potential to be beautiful, but also kind of falls a bit flat, especially if you're attending outside of the height of the flower blooming period in May. Later in this decade, in 2009, another attraction would open, this one in Fukuoka, which is low-key my favorite part of Japan. This park would open at the Kashikain Amusement Park, called Sylvanian Gardens. Unfortunately, the entire park, which opened in 1956, actually closed at the end of 2021. So, the first 10 years of the 2000s were definitely a period of monumental change for Sylvanian Families, not just in the UK with Flair, but also in Japan. Tons of projects in addition to all the figures and set releases. Sylvanian Families, especially in Japan, was just exploding. They were experimenting and meeting fans and just giving them more ways to experience this toy. They were like truly growing the brand. But arguably, the biggest changes really did happen in 2008 with that huge purchase of International Playthings. And I know I mentioned before, but I really kind of glossed over it. And this was such a huge deal for Epic that we really do need to take some moments and talk about it a bit more. So, okay, remember, International Playthings Inc. took over Sylvanian Families, or I should say Calico Critters, distribution in the USA in 1999, after Tomy America gives up their rights. Tomy UK has also given up the rights across the pond in the late 90s, remember? And Flair took over in 1999 as well. According to Epic's CEO, buying International Playthings in America in 2008 was an absolute turning point for them. This was the beginning of them really becoming the worldwide brand that they are today, because it was their first big move to have full control over the toy line in a huge market. Also in 2008, Epic purchases a Chinese factory. So this means then they now had also full control over the production line. So this, combined with owning their distributor in America, made it so that way they could really oversee and control the US market. So the stage was now set for the future streamlined brand of Sylvanian Families / Calico Critters. Well, actually, that's the end of part 1 of our Sylvanian Families saga. I mean, this is a 40-year story, so just ended up being much too long for just one episode. So please stay tuned for part 2, where we will head into the 2010s, look at Epic's worldwide domination plan, their global strategy of standardizing the toy. We'll also cover new animes, along with books and IRL events happening in Japan.
Sylvanian Family. こんにちは。
Lots and lots to talk about, and of course we'll discuss some of the drama surrounding this toy. Yes, we've got controversies, recalls, and lawsuits to cover, along with unusual Sylvanian Families collaborations. For example, a collaboration with an architecture firm, if you can believe it. And lastly, we can't forget the onslaught of fan-created content and collections that have absolutely flooded the internet in the last few years. We'll cover all of it. Oh, and we'll have a couple more picnic snacks too. So, that's that for part 1. I'm Jess, writer, host, and crazy trinket auntie of the Trinket Picnic Podcast. Thanks for listening, my fine friends, and see you next time. Bye!
Sylvanian Families. They come from far and near.